The morning sky over Los Angeles was painted with golden light as Flight 392 prepared for departure. Passengers streamed through Gate 17, some still half asleep, others glued to their phones, unaware that this ordinary flight would soon become one of the most unbelievable stories in aviation history. Among them was Emily Turner, a 27-year-old waitress from Denver. She wasn't supposed to be on this flight. Her original flight had been canceled, forcing her to take this one. A minor inconvenience, she thought. Wearing a simple blue jacket and carrying a small tote bag, she settled into seat 18A near the wing, ready for a short nap before takeoff. Flight 392 was bound for Seattle, a routine 2-hour journey at 30,000 feet, flown by 2 experienced pilots and attended by 4 cabin crew. To Emily, it felt like just another day. But fate had already chosen her for something extraordinary. As the plane taxied to the runway, the hum of the engines filled the cabin. Passengers fastened their seatbelts. Flight attendants demonstrated safety procedures, and the captain's calm voice came over the intercom. Reassuring, confident routine. Moments later, the Boeing 737 lifted into the air, cutting through clouds and sunlight with effortless grace. At 30,000 feet, everything seemed perfect. The seatbelt signs turned off. Coffee carts rolled down the aisle. Laughter and soft conversation filled the cabin. Emily smiled politely as the attendant offered her orange juice. She had no idea that within the hour, every eye on the plane would turn toward her, the one person with no training, no experience, and no reason to believe she could fly an aircraft. The first sign of trouble came quietly. A faint noise echoed from the cockpit, a sound no one recognized. Then a sudden jolt shook the plane, barely noticeable at first. A few passengers exchanged nervous glances. The flight attendants stayed calm, assuring everyone it was just turbulence. But then the cockpit door remained closed for too long. Normally, one of the pilots would check in with the cabin crew every few minutes. This time, there was silence. The head flight attendant, Lisa, knocked on the cockpit door. No answer. She tried again, her voice slightly trembling. Still nothing. That's when panic began to creep in. She grabbed the intercom and called the first officer. Silence. The captain. Silence again. Lisa turned pale. She used her emergency key and pushed the cockpit door open, and froze. Both pilots were slumped forward in their seats, unconscious. The aircraft was still flying on autopilot, but there was no one in control. The horror spread fast. Flight attendants rushed to assist, shaking the pilots, calling for any medical professionals on board. A doctor among the passengers checked their pulses. Both men were alive but unresponsive. Possibly oxygen deprivation, he said. Maybe a sudden medical reaction. No one knew for sure. Now 179 lives depended on a plane flying itself. The autopilot held altitude, but for how long? Lisa tried contacting air traffic control through the cockpit radio, but she didn't know the system. Her voice cracked with fear as static filled the speakers. The passengers could feel something was terribly wrong. A few began to pray, others cried quietly. Amid the chaos, Emily noticed the flashing light above the cockpit console. It indicated autopilot, engaged, a feature she vaguely recognized from documentaries she'd watched out of curiosity. She had always been fascinated by machines, by how things worked. Not enough to be an expert, but enough to understand patterns. Lisa turned to the passengers and asked the unthinkable. Is there anyone on board who knows how to fly a plane? A heavy silence followed. Heads turned. No one raised a hand. The next 30 minutes were pure chaos. Flight attendants attempted to relay messages through the emergency frequency, trying to reach ground control. The plane continued smoothly for now, but the fuel indicators were dropping, and without pilots to manage descent, autopilot would eventually disengage. Emily felt her heart pounding as she stared toward the cockpit. Something inside her wouldn't let her just sit there. Fear battled with instinct, and instinct won. She stood up, walked down the aisle, and entered the cockpit. The sight was surreal. Panels of blinking lights, screens filled with codes and numbers, and 2 lifeless pilots beside her. She took a deep breath and steadied her hands. The radio crackled faintly, static, then a faint voice. Flight 392, this is Seattle Center. Do you copy? Emily froze. Then, with trembling fingers, she picked up the headset and spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady enough. This is Flight 392. Both pilots are unconscious. For a few seconds, there was silence on the other end. Then the controller responded, alarmed but composed. Understood. Flight 392. Who am I speaking with? Emily Turner. I'm a passenger. The voice on the radio changed tone. Calm, deliberate, guiding. All right, Emily, we're going to help you. Stay calm. Can you confirm the plane is flying steady? She looked at the altimeter, the number held at 30,000 feet. The horizon line was level. Yes, she said. It's steady. On the ground, emergency teams were already scrambling. The air traffic controller had just relayed the impossible. A civilian passenger was at the controls of a Boeing 737, with both pilots incapacitated. The FAA coordinated with nearby air bases. Fighter jets were alerted to track the aircraft in case of loss of control. Inside the cockpit, Emily followed instructions step by step. Her voice trembled, but she obeyed every word. She found the throttle levers, confirmed the autopilot light, and relayed readings from the flight instruments. Slowly, she began to understand what each number meant. Below her, 179 lives sat in silent terror. Some prayed, others clutched hands, and a few stared out the windows, watching the endless clouds. They didn't know who was in the cockpit, only that someone was. That someone was a waitress who had never even stepped inside a cockpit before. Today, the controller asked her to check the oxygen levels in the cockpit. Emily located the masks, placed one over each pilot's face, and secured hers as well. The altitude was still stable. The plane was safe, for now. But fuel was running low, and the hardest part was yet to come. Landing. As the sun began to lower on the horizon, the sky glowed in shades of orange and gold. From the cabin windows, the view was breathtaking. No one would ever forget that sunset. The last peaceful image before chaos would return. Because 30 minutes later, autopilot would disengage automatically. And when it did, the Boeing 737 would no longer fly itself. Emily didn't know it yet. But she was about to attempt something that even trained pilots feared. Landing a jet without experience, and 179 people were counting on her to succeed. Emily's hands trembled as she stared at the maze of buttons and screens in front of her. The faint hum of the engines filled the cockpit. Steady and powerful, but the calm was deceptive. Every minute that passed brought them closer to disaster. The air traffic controller's voice echoed through her headset. Calm, firm, confident. He became her lifeline, her invisible co-pilot. On the radar below, hundreds of miles of airspace stretched between Flight 392 and the ground. There was no pilot left to fly this aircraft. Only Emily. She had no time to think about fear. The voice in her ear guided her to check the systems one by one. Altitude, steady at 30,000 feet. Throttle, constant. Heading, locked. Fuel, dropping faster than expected. Emily repeated the numbers aloud, her breathing shallow but controlled. The controller explained that they needed to prepare for descent soon, autopilot. Couldn't keep the plane aloft forever. The plan was simple in theory. Keep calm. Follow instructions and trust the aircraft. But theory rarely matched reality. Down in the cabin, panic was spreading. The passengers had pieced together what was happening. Some clutched their loved ones, others prayed quietly, tears running down their faces. A child asked his mother if they were going to crash. No one could answer. The head flight attendant, Lisa, tried to keep order. She walked through the aisles, her face calm though her hands shook. "The situation is under control," she said softly to anyone who asked. "We have communication with ground control." But everyone knew the truth. A passenger, a waitress, was flying the plane. Back in the cockpit, Emily focused on the glowing panel of instruments. The voice guided her through locating the transponder, ensuring their signal was visible to every radar station and approaching escort. The Seattle Center had requested 2 fighter jets from a nearby airbase to visually monitor Flight 392, just in case. Outside the cockpit windows, the endless blue sky was beginning to darken. Clouds formed below, golden from the sinking sun. For a brief moment, Emily felt something strange, calm. The vastness of the sky, the isolation, and the quiet hum of the engines reminded her of something simple. She wasn't alone. The air traffic controller was with her. The cabin crew was counting on her. 179 lives depended on her next move. Then came the instruction she dreaded most. It was time to take control. The controller explained that autopilot would soon disengage for descent. Emily would have to manage the plane's angle, speed, and altitude manually. Her heart raced as she repeated the steps in her mind. The autopilot light blinked once, then turned off. The plane shuddered. The nose dipped slightly, alarms chirped. Emily gasped and grabbed the yoke instinctively, pulling back gently just as the controller instructed. The Boeing 737 stabilized. She had control. For a moment, it didn't feel real. Her hands on the controls of a jet flying 30,000 feet above the earth. A waitress from Denver, now holding the lives of 179 strangers in her trembling fingers. Ground control instructed her to turn the aircraft toward Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She looked at the compass indicator and gently turned the yoke. The wings tilted and the horizon shifted. The massive aircraft began a smooth, careful turn to the north. In the cabin, passengers felt the change in direction. Some gasped, others held on to their seats, bracing for the unknown. But the movement was steady, almost graceful. For the first time, hope flickered among them. Minutes later, 2 fighter jets appeared on either side of the Boeing 737. Sleek, silver, and powerful, they flew close enough that Emily could see the pilots inside. One of them saluted her through the canopy, then pointed toward the direction of descent. Tears welled in her eyes. Help was there. She wasn't flying blind anymore. The radio buzzed again. The controller explained how to begin a slow descent. Emily adjusted the throttle and flaps as instructed. The plane dipped slightly. The altitude numbers began to fall. 29,000 feet, 27,000, 25,000. Each 1,000 feet felt like a victory. As they descended through thick clouds, turbulence hit. The aircraft shook violently. Coffee cups tumbled. Passengers screamed, but Emily's grip tightened on the yoke. Her knuckles went white. She kept her eyes on the artificial horizon, the blue above, the brown below. Her breath came fast, but she didn't lose focus. The voice on the radio calmly guided her through every second. Hold steady. Correct your pitch. Reduce speed slightly. She obeyed every instruction with mechanical precision. Her mind shut out the noise, the fear, the shaking. For the first time in her life, Emily Turner wasn't just reacting, she was commanding. The turbulence passed and the aircraft leveled out again. The fighter jet stayed close, guiding her visually toward Seattle. By now, the sun was gone. The sky turned deep violet, stars beginning to emerge above. Below, the city lights shimmered faintly through the clouds, a distant promise of safety. The radio confirmed she was aligned for approach, still miles away but closing in. The most dangerous part was yet to come, the landing. Emily could feel exhaustion creeping in. Her arms ached from holding the controls. Her throat was dry. But she didn't stop. The voice in her headset encouraged her, giving clear, deliberate instructions. She followed every step. Below 10,000 feet, the plane entered heavier air. The speed had to drop. Flaps had to extend. The descent had to be perfect. Too steep and they'd crash. Too slow and they'd stall. Inside the cabin, passengers braced themselves. Some whispered prayers. Others closed their eyes. A few looked toward the cockpit door, silently thanking whoever was inside for not giving up. The altimeter dropped, 8,000 feet, 6,000, 4,000. Emily saw faint lights on the horizon, the airport runway glowing through, mist and night. The fighter jets broke formation, giving her space to approach. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. The radio instructed her to align with the runway lights. She turned the yoke gently, feeling the massive jet respond to her touch. The descent was smooth now, almost peaceful. For a few seconds, time seemed to stop. She thought of her life before this, the long nights serving coffee, the endless double shifts, the dream she'd once had of doing something extraordinary. She never imagined it would come like this. Now at 4,000 feet, she was about to do what seemed impossible. Bring a Boeing 737 safely to the ground. As the landing lights glowed brighter ahead, Emily wiped her tears and tightened her grip on the controls. The air traffic controller's final words echoed in her headset. "You've got this." The runway was waiting. The city lights shimmered below, and 179 lives held their breath. The runway lights glimmered faintly through the fog, stretching like a glowing path of hope. Emily's eyes locked onto them as the air traffic controller's voice echoed through her headset. Every breath she took felt heavier. Every second felt longer. The Boeing 737 was descending through 3,000 feet. Faster than ideal, but stable. The fighter jets had broken formation now, circling from a distance, ready to report every movement of the aircraft. On the ground, emergency vehicles lined the tarmac, fire trucks, ambulances, and flashing lights forming a sea of red and blue beneath the night sky. Everyone was waiting for Flight 392. Inside the cockpit, Emily could feel the aircraft trembling under her control. The engines roared with restrained power. The speed indicators flickered, and the autopilot was long gone. It was just her, two unconscious pilots, and a storm of decisions no untrained person should ever have to make. The controller instructed her to lower the flaps, to slow the plane and prepare for approach. Her hands moved instinctively, repeating the steps she'd memorized over the radio. A deep whir filled the cabin as the flaps extended. The aircraft shuddered again, slowing slightly. Below 2,000 feet, the turbulence grew stronger. Crosswinds pushed the jet from side to side. Emily gripped the yoke tighter, her knuckles white. Sweat ran down her forehead, but she didn't dare blink. The glowing runway was now directly ahead, closer with every heartbeat. In the cabin, passengers could see the city lights below. Gasps and cries filled the aisles. A man clutched his wife's hand. A mother hugged her child tightly. The head flight attendant, Lisa, held the intercom with shaking hands, telling everyone to stay seated and fasten their belts. They all knew the truth. The landing would decide their fate. Every vibration, every dip in altitude, every sound from the engines was magnified by fear. But there was also a strange calm among them now, a silent, collective prayer that the stranger in the cockpit could perform a miracle. At 1,500 feet, alarm sounded in the cockpit. The warning tone blared through her headset. Terrain! Pull up! Pull up! Her heart stopped for a second. The descent rate was too steep. She gently pulled back on the yoke, following the calm voice of the controller in her ear. The nose of the aircraft lifted slightly. The runway lights became clearer, closer, brighter. The engines screamed as she adjusted the throttle, balancing between too fast and too slow. The voice guided her step by step. Level out. Reduce speed. Maintain your glide. Her breathing steadied again. She was doing it. The runway grew larger, filling the cockpit window. She could almost see the lines, the reflection of lights on the wet surface. The Boeing 737 was now just 800 feet above the ground. On the ground, air traffic controllers held their breath. Fire crews stood ready with hoses aimed. The world outside was holding still. Inside the cockpit, time slowed. The air was thick with the hum of engines and the steady tone of altitude warnings. Emily's eyes flicked between the instruments and the window. 600 feet. 400? 200? The radio crackled again. You're looking good. Keep it steady. Her right hand moved to the throttle. Her left hand steadied the yoke. The runway lights rushed toward her. Then came the hardest part, the flare. The moment before touchdown when the pilot must gently lift the nose, balancing between flying and falling. Get it wrong, and the plane slams into the ground. Get it right, and the landing gear kisses the runway. At 50 feet, she pulled back gently. The plane responded with a soft rise. The engines quieted, and the world held its breath. Then, impact. A deep, thunderous thud as the landing gear hit the tarmac. The cabin jolted violently. Luggage fell from overhead bins. Passengers screamed. But the aircraft didn't bounce. It rolled, hard but controlled. Emily's hands shook as she tried to keep the plane aligned with the runway. The aircraft veered slightly left. She corrected it instinctively, her eyes darting between the center line and the instrument panel. Smoke rose from the tires. The speed was dropping. 160 knots. 40, 120. She slammed the brakes, guided by the calm voice in her ear. Reverse thrust engaged. A deafening roar. The Boeing 737 slowed rapidly, tires screeching, engines howling. And then at last, silence. The aircraft came to a complete stop. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal and the fading hum of the engines. Then from the cabin, a single sob broke the silence, followed by applause. Within seconds, the entire plane erupted in cheers, tears, and cries of relief. People hugged strangers, shouted prayers, and clapped uncontrollably. Flight 392 had landed. Emily leaned back in the seat, her entire body trembling. Tears blurred her vision as she looked out through the cockpit window. Emergency lights flashed across the wet runway. Fire trucks approached from all sides, their red beacons reflecting in the glass. She removed the headset slowly. Her ears still rang with the voice of the controller, the stranger who had guided her through the impossible. Inside the cabin, the flight attendants rushed to check on passengers. Some were still crying, others in disbelief. The smell of burnt rubber filled the air. The lights flickered as the engines powered down. Lisa entered the cockpit, her face streaked with tears. She looked at Emily, still sitting in the captain's chair, frozen in shock. No words were needed. She simply placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, whispering a soft, "Thank you." Outside, rescue teams surrounded the aircraft. Paramedics boarded quickly, checking the unconscious pilots first. Both were alive, still weak but breathing. The cause of their collapse remained a mystery, but at that moment, no one cared. They had survived. All of them. News broke within minutes. The story flashed across screens around the world. Passenger lands. Boeing 737 after both pilots. Collapse, 179 lives saved. Airlines, aviation experts, and pilots across the globe were stunned. Many called it a miracle of calmness and courage. Others called it the luckiest flight in history. But for Emily Turner, sitting quietly as the paramedics checked her pulse, it didn't feel like a miracle. It felt surreal, like waking up from a dream she hadn't chosen. She didn't see herself as a hero. She was just a waitress who refused to freeze when everyone else did. As the passengers disembarked one by one, many stopped to thank her. Some hugged her. Others simply touched her arm with silent gratitude. The last person to leave the plane was Lisa. She turned back toward the cockpit and smiled through tears. The lights of emergency vehicles flashed behind her as she whispered softly to herself. She saved us. Emily stood at the doorway of the aircraft, feeling the cool night air for the first time in hours. The runway stretched endlessly before her, the lights shimmering in the darkness. Somewhere behind her, a child's voice said what everyone felt but couldn't express. She flew the plane. The night was thick, with rain and flashing lights as the Boeing 737 came to a stop on the runway. Fire trucks surrounded it like silent guardians, spraying mist across the tarmac. Inside, everything was still. Emily sat in the cockpit, her hands frozen on the controls. The engines whined down slowly, echoing through the metal frame. Behind her, passengers were silent, too shocked to cheer, too drained to move. For a few seconds, the only sound was the ticking of cooling metal. Then someone sobbed. Another whispered, "We're alive." Emily's chest rose and fell in disbelief. She removed her headset and stared out the window. Red and blue lights flashed through the rain, reflecting on her tear-streaked face. She had done it. Rescue crews rushed aboard. Paramedics checked the pilots, both unconscious but alive. Oxygen failure, they said, a freak system malfunction. Passengers were helped off one by one, wrapped in blankets, guided toward waiting buses. Many paused to look back at the cockpit. They knew the young woman sitting there had done the impossible. When the last person left, Emily stayed in her seat, trembling. Lisa, the head flight attendant, stepped in quietly, her voice shaking with emotion. "It's over," she whispered. "You did it." Emily didn't speak. She just looked down at her, hands still shaking, and exhaled. For the first time in what felt like hours, outside, chaos turned into relief. News crews gathered behind security barriers. Firefighters exchanged looks of disbelief. Up in the control tower, the air traffic controllers who had guided her through were hugging, some crying openly. No one could believe it. Hours later, in a quiet airport room, Emily sat wrapped in a blanket surrounded by officials. They spoke softly, asking how she'd managed to land the plane. "I just didn't want anyone to die," she said simply. That was all. By morning, the world knew her name. Headlines blazed across every screen. Waitress lands passenger jet, 179 lives saved. Photos of the jet on the runway went viral. News anchors called her a hero. Flight schools offered scholarships. Airlines sent gifts, but Emily avoided the cameras. She didn't feel like a hero, just someone who had done what had to be done. Weeks passed. She stayed quiet, ignoring interviews until one day she finally spoke. Sitting calmly under bright studio lights, she said, "I was terrified, but someone had to move. Fear never disappears. You just decide what to do while it's still there. Her words spread like wildfire. People quoted her on posters, in classrooms, in flight safety courses. Months later, Emily visited the hangar where Flight 392 was stored. The cabin was empty, silent. She walked slowly to the cockpit, ran her fingers along the worn controls, and closed her eyes. Every sound came back, the alarms, the wind, the voice from the tower. But now, instead of fear, she felt something different. Gratitude. The airline held a small private ceremony to honor her. The two pilots, now fully recovered, were there too. When they embraced her, one whispered, "You saved us all." Emily shook her head. "No," she said softly. "We saved each other." Years passed. The story of flight. 392 became a case study in aviation. Schools around the world, simulators recreated her landing. Her name became a symbol of courage under pressure. But Emily returned to her quiet life in Denver. She went back to the small cafe where she worked before the flight. Customers recognized her. Some asked for photos, some just said thank you. She always smiled and replied, "I just got lucky." But deep down, she knew it wasn't luck. It was courage, the kind that rises when the world falls silent. And someone has to act. One evening, Emily stood by her window, watching a plane cross the sunset sky. Its lights blinked like stars above the clouds. She smiled, whispered a small prayer for whoever was inside, and turned away. Because she knew something most people never would. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they just take a seat. And when fate calls, they stand up,